41. This address had a dramatic effect on all ranks and inspired them with the utmost enthusiasm and eagerness for action. First of all, the men of the 10th commissioned their military tribunes to thank Caesar for his high opinion of them, and to assure him that they were ready to take the field at any moment. Then the other legions prevailed on their tribunes and first-grade centurions to make their peace with him, professing that they had never entertained doubts or fears, and had never imagined that it was for them to direct the campaign, which they realized was their commander's business. Accepting their excuses, Caesar told Diviciacus to study the available routes because he trusted him more than any of the other Gauls, and was advised by him to make a detour of some 50 miles, which would enable them to march through open country. Starting in the small hours, as he had said he would, he marched without interruption for 6 days, and was then informed by his patrols that Ariovistus's forces were 23 miles away. 42. Hearing that Caesar had moved nearer, Ariovistus sent a message saying that he had no objection to arranging the interview previously requested, as he thought he could now do so without risk. Caesar did not reject his offer, thinking that Ariovistus was now coming to his senses again, since he undertook of his own accord to do what he had refused before when asked. He hoped, too, that the recollection of the great favours the king had received from himself and the Roman government would make him abandon his stubborn attitude when he heard what was required of him. The interview was arranged for the 5th day following, and in the meantime messengers kept going to and fro between them. Ariovistus insisted that Caesar should not bring any infantry to the conference. He was afraid, he said, of being caught in a trap. Each of them must come with a mounted escort only, otherwise he would not come at all. As Caesar did not want to give him an excuse for cancelling the meeting, yet dared not entrust his safety to the Gallic cavalry, he decided that his best course would be to take away all their horses and mount upon them the infantrymen of the 10th Legion, in whom he had such complete confidence, and thus have an escort on whose devotion he could rely absolutely in the case of need. While this was being done, one of the legionnaires made quite a witty remark. "Caesar's being better than his word," he said. "He promised to make the 10th his bodyguard, and now he's knighting us." 43. In an extensive plain there stood a fairly high mound of earth, about equidistant from the camps of Caesar and Ariovistus. Here they came, as agreed, to hold their conference. The mounted legion that Caesar had brought was posted some 300 yards away from the mound, and Ariovistus's horsemen took up their position at an equal distance. The king stipulated that they should confer on horseback, each accompanied by 10 men. On reaching the place, Caesar began by recalling the favours that he himself and the Senate had conferred on Ariovistus, how he had been honoured with the titles of king and friend, and had received handsome presents, pointing out that very few princes had been granted such distinctions, which were usually reserved for those who had rendered important services to Rome. "You would have had no right," he said, "to apply to the Senate for any such favours. You owe them entirely to my kindness and my generosity and that of the Senate. The friendship between my country and the Aedui is of long standing and founded on solid grounds. Resolutions of the Senate, expressed in most complimentary terms, have repeatedly been passed in their honour. They held a position of supremacy in Gaul all along, even before they sought our friendship. And since it has always been our policy to see that our allies and friends, far from losing anything they had already, should have their credit, honour and importance increased, how can we allow them to be robbed of what they already had when they became our friends?" He then repeated the demands which he had instructed his envoys to present, that Ariovistus should not make war on the Aedui or their allies, that he should restore their hostages, and even if he could not send any of the Germans back home, he should at least not let any more cross the Rhine. 44. Ariovistus had little to say in reply to these demands, but spoke at length about his own merits. He had crossed the Rhine, he said, not of his own accord, but in response to the invitation of the Gauls, and it had needed the prospect of a rich reward to induce him to leave his home and his relatives. The possessions he had in Gaul had been ceded to him by the Gauls themselves, and the hostages had been given voluntarily. As for the tribute he exacted, this was customarily regarded as the right of a victorious belligerent. He had not been the aggressor. The Gauls had attacked him, all their tribes having marched out and taken the field against him. He had completely routed their entire force in a single battle. If they wanted to try their luck again, he was quite ready for another fight. If they wanted peace, it was unfair for them to object to the tribute that they had hitherto paid without demur. The friendship of the Roman people ought to be a distinction and a protection to him, not an occasion of loss, and it was with this expectation that he had sought it. If through Roman interference his subjects were absolved from payment and withdrawn from his control, he would be just as ready to discard that friendship as he had been to seek it. The large number of Germans he was bringing into Gaul were brought to secure his safety, not for aggression. The proof of that was that he had not come till he was asked, and had fought only in self-defense. However, he had come there before the Romans, whose armies had never before marched beyond the frontier of the province. What did Caesar mean by invading his dominions? This part of the country, he said, is my province, just as the other part is yours. I could not expect you to let me make raids into your territory with impunity, and it is a gross injustice for you to interfere with me in the exercise of my lawful rights. You say that the Aedui have been called brothers by the Roman Senate. Well, I may be a barbarian, but I am not such a barbarian and not so ignorant as not to know that in the recent revolt of the Allobroges, 61 BC, you got no help from the Aedui, and that they had to do without the benefit of your assistance in the war they have just fought with me and the Sequani. I suspect that this talk of friendship is just so much pretense, and that your object in keeping an army in Gaul is to crush me. Unless you take yourself off from this country and your army with you, it won't be as a friend that I shall treat you. In fact, if I killed you, there are plenty of nobles and politicians in Rome who would thank me for it. I know this because they themselves commissioned their agents to tell me so. I could make them all my grateful friends by putting an end to you. But if you will go away and leave me in undisturbed possession of Gaul, I will reward you handsomely, and whenever you want a war fought, I will see the job through for you without your lifting a finger or running any risk. 45. Caesar explained at some length why he could not think of abandoning his intention. It was contrary to his principles and to those of the Roman government to desert a loyal ally, and he could not admit that Gaul belonged to Ariovistus any more than to Rome. The Arverni and the Ruteni had been conquered by Quintus Fabius Maximus, 121 BC, although the Roman people afterwards pardoned their hostility and refrained from annexing their lands or exacting tribute from them. If priority of arrival was to be the criterion, the Romans' title to rule Gaul was unimpeachable. If they were to abide by the decision of the Senate, Gaul ought to be independent, since the Senate had determined that, although conquered, it should be allowed self-government. 46. While these questions were being argued, word was brought to Caesar that Ariovistus's horsemen were approaching nearer the mound, riding towards our soldiers and throwing stones and javelins at them. Caesar broke off the conversation, went to his men, and forbade them to throw a single missile in retaliation. For although he knew that a legion of picked troops could engage cavalry without the slightest risk, he did not choose to give anyone the chance of saying, if the enemy were driven off, that he had broken his word by treachery, attacking them during a parley. When the news spread through the ranks of the army that Ariovistus had arrogantly warned the Romans of the whole of Gaul, and that his cavalry had interrupted the conference by attacking our troops, the men's enthusiasm and eagerness for battle knew no bounds. 47. The next day Ariovistus sent envoys to Caesar to say that he wished to resume their interrupted discussion, and to ask him either to appoint a day for another personal interview, or, if he did not want to do that, to send an officer to represent him. Caesar did not see anything was to be gained by a further interview, especially as on the previous day Ariovistus had been unable to restrain his men from attacking the Roman troops, and he thought it would be running a great risk to send a Roman officer and place him at the mercy of such savages. He decided that his best plan was to send Gaius Valerius Proculus, a young man of high character and liberal education, whose father, Gaius Valerius Caberus, had been granted Roman citizenship by Gaius Valerius Flaccus. Proculus was a man who could be trusted. His knowledge of the Gallic language would be useful, since by long practice Ariovistus had learned to speak it fluently, and in his case the Germans would have no motive for foul play. With him he sent Marcus Metius, who was bound to Ariovistus by ties of hospitality, and their orders were to hear what the king had to say and report to Caesar. But as soon as Ariovistus saw them at his camp headquarters, he shouted out in front of his whole army, "What are you coming here for? To play the spy, I suppose?" And when they attempted to speak, he stopped them and had them put in chains. 48. On the same day, he advanced and took up a position at the foot of a mountain 6 miles from Caesar's camp. The next day he marched his army past the camp and himself encamped 2 miles farther on, with the object of intercepting the convoys of grain and other supplies that were being sent up from the Sequani and the Aedui. On each of the 5 days following, Caesar led his troops out in front of his camp and kept them for some time in line of battle, so as to give Ariovistus the opportunity of fighting if he wanted to. But each day the king kept his main forces in camp, merely engaging in cavalry skirmishes. The Germans were trained in the use of a special battle technique. They had a force of 6,000 cavalry, each of whom had selected from the whole army, for his personal protection, 1 infantryman of outstanding courage and speed of foot. These accompanied the cavalry in battle and acted as support for them to fall back upon. In a critical situation, they ran to the rescue and surrounded any cavalryman who had been unhorsed by a severe wound. They acquired such agility by practice that in a long advance or a quick retreat they could hang on to the horses' manes and keep pace with them. 49. Caesar saw that the Germans were not going to come out of their camp, and since he could not afford to be cut off from supplies any longer, he chose a suitable site for a camp about 1,000 yards beyond the enemy's position and marched there in battle formation of 3 lines. The first and second lines were ordered to stand by under arms, the third to make fortifications for the camp. The place being less than a mile away, Ariovistus sent some 16,000 light infantry and all his cavalry to overawe our soldiers and prevent them from continuing the work. Caesar, however, did not vary his original plan. The first 2 lines were told to drive off the enemy, while the third finished their task. When the entrenchments of the camp were completed, he left 2 legions and a detachment of auxiliaries to occupy it, and led the other 4 legions back to the large camp. 50. The next day he followed his usual routine by bringing the troops out of both camps, deploying them for action a short distance from the large camp, and offering battle. Finding that even then the enemy would not come out, he returned to camp about midday, whereupon Ariovistus at last sent a detachment to attack the small camp, and a hotly contested battle was kept up until evening. At sunset, after severe casualties had been sustained by both sides, Ariovistus retired. On inquiring from prisoners why he would not fight a general engagement, Caesar was told that the German matrons, who used to draw lots and employ other methods of divination to decide whether it was advisable to join battle, had pronounced that the Germans were not destined to win if they fought before the new moon.